Today, we have Benjamin Balint with us speaking about his book, Kafka's Last Trial. Kafka's Last Trial begins with Kafka's last instruction to his closest friend, Max Brod, to destroy all his remaining papers upon his death. But when the moment arrived in 1924, Brod could not bring himself to burn the unpublished works of the man he considered a literary genius, even a saint. Instead, Brod devoted his life to championing Kafka's writing, rescuing his legacy from obscurity and physical destruction. By the time of Brod's death in Tel Aviv in 1968, Kafka's major works had been published, transforming the once little-known writer into a pillar of literary modernism. Yet, Brod left a wealth of still unpublished papers to his secretary, Esther Hoffe, who sold some, held on to the rest, and then passed the bulk of them on to her daughters, who in turn refused to release them. An international legal battle erupted to determine who could claim ownership of Kafka's work: Hoffe's family, Israel, where Kafka dreamed of living but never entered, or Germany, as Kafka wrote exclusively in German. Benjamin Balint offers a gripping account of the controversial trial in Israeli courts, brimming with dilemmas, legal, ethical, and political, that determined the fate of Kafka's manuscripts. Benjamin Balint is the author of Bruno Schulz's biography and Kafka's Last Trial. He was awarded the 2020 Semi-Rhodes Prize for Jewish Literature and is the co-author of Jerusalem, City of the Book. A library fellow at the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, he regularly writes on culture for the Wall Street Journal, the Jewish Review of Books, and other publications. You may please use the link given in the show notes to buy the books mentioned. Please follow and review the Harshniyam podcast on Apple and Spotify apps.
I've always thought of literature not as an escape from reality, but as a way of interpreting reality, as a way of training ourselves as readers to see better, to understand better, to be able to be not only close readers, but close interpreters of our own world. And therefore, the authors that have always attracted me are those who allow us somehow to understand our world, to capture something in words that we may have sensed but never been able to capture or articulate ourselves.
Now, you said interpreting reality. Is that the reason you're also into writing only non-fiction?
I understand my, let's say, my own limitations. There are very many writers whose strengths are in the non-fiction or essayistic vein, who then can't help but follow the temptations of non-fiction and try their hands at writing fiction and novels. I think of Susan Sontag, I think of George Steiner, I think of people who are primarily brilliant literary critics who then can't help but wish to translate their own modes of reading into fictional modes of writing. And I've never been really tempted by that. I'm content with being simply a close reader.
Before we move on to the current topic, that's about Kafka's Last Trial, please tell us about the other two books. One is the earlier one, that is Jerusalem, City of the Book, which of course interestingly about books. And other recent work is Chasing Bruno Schulz.
Well, I co-authored a book that tells the story of Jerusalem, which is my home for some years, not as a story of competing, let's say, territorial rivalries, and not as a story of successive destructions and catastrophes, but rather to tell it as a textual history, to tell the story of Jerusalem's diverse communities through those communities' libraries and archives. So the one thing that all of these books have in common by which I mean Jerusalem, City of the Book, which I co-authored with a wonderful scholar named Merav Mack, Kafka's Last Trial, and the latest book about Bruno Schulz. What they all have in common is a question of how our material culture, in this case textual culture, books and manuscripts, act as anchors of our own identities, of our communal identities, act to as transportable briefcases of wisdom, you might say, as portable homelands. George Steiner, who we mentioned just a minute ago, has a wonderful essay called Our Homeland, the Text. And then what each of those books has in common is the impulse that's very strong in Jerusalem to gather not just people and refugees, as was the case after the Second World War, as was the case of Kafka's very closest friend, who we'll get to shortly, but to act as almost as a center of gravitation which pulls towards it material heritage and texts and books from all over the world. To understand Jerusalem as a place where Kafka's manuscripts belong somehow, even though they weren't written there. To understand Jerusalem as a place where Bruno Schulz's last artworks belong, even though they were painted elsewhere. To understand it as the culmination of stories that were told elsewhere. And so that's sort of what ties, a thread that ties together a lot of my inquiries over the last years, is to try to understand how various communities, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, how they all connect their diasporas with their homelands through this sort of process of ingathering of material culture.
Now, the book that we are going to talk about, Kafka's Last Trial, the way you structured the book, it made it very, very interesting for me to read. Reason being, you started with the legal proceedings. For first chapter, you deal with the legal proceedings, and whatever is discussed in the court, you go back and trace the history of that in Kafka's life.
Well, that speaks to your earlier question, which is to say, although I don't write fiction, it's of course possible for nonfiction writers to import the techniques of fiction, even while writing nonfiction that remains true to the facts. So this book is really, as you mentioned, a story of this international struggle to preserve Kafka's literary legacy. And on the one hand, there are two beginning places. One beginning place would begin with Kafka's last instruction to his closest friend, Max Brod, in which he famously asked his friend to destroy all of his remaining papers, to burn them, when he died very young, almost 41 years old in 1924. But when that moment arrived, Max Brod could not bring himself to burn these unpublished works of a writer that he considered a genius, even a saint. Instead, as you know, Max Brod devoted his life to doing the opposite, to championing Kafka's writings, to rescuing his legacy, both from Kafka's own will and from obscurity and from physical destruction. So, in answer to your question, when I was looking at the trial that took place in Israel, I thought, this story of Kafka's posthumous life, of his afterlife, is itself kind of Kafkaesque. Because by the time of Max Brod's own death in Tel Aviv in 1968, thanks to him, Kafka's major works and novels had been published, and thanks to Brod, Kafka had been transformed, from a once little-known writer into someone who stands at the very center of literary modernism, and at the same time, and we'll talk about this, I suppose, Brod left a lot of these papers to his secretary and to his lover, who in turn refused to release them. And this is the beginning of this international legal battle that erupted to determine which country could claim ownership of Kafka's work. Was it going to be Israel, where Kafka dreamed of living, but of course never never arrived to? Or was it going to be Germany, where on the one hand Kafka wrote in German language, but on the other hand it's also the place that's responsible for the murder of Kafka's three sisters during the Holocaust. So when I was sitting in this trial that reached the Israeli Supreme Court in the summer of 2016, I realized, okay, it's not just a trial, but just beneath the surface are all these dilemmas, legal, ethical, political, and that's why I decided to start actually in 2016, not to start chronologically with the death of Kafka in 1924, but to start in 2016 and to trace how this trial that took place almost 100 years after Kafka's death really depended on interpretations of Kafka's works. To determine who owns Kafka is also to determine, in a sense, what kind of writer Kafka was. And that prompted the structure of the book to begin more or less in the present, and then by a series of flashbacks to look at this very interesting relationship between two writers in Prague, Franz Kafka and Max Brod, and how this biographical portrait, right, in a way paralleled the story of these two countries who much later were both obsessed with overcoming the traumas of their past through the intermediary means of the works of Franz Kafka.
So that decision, telling the story in series of flashbacks, it worked wonderfully well. Kafka, of course, we all know is a writer from Prague. So how did his manuscripts, they end up in Jerusalem?
Closest Kafka ever came to the Holy Land, to Israel, was a plan that he sort of half amusingly hatched with his last lover, Dora Diamant, to open a restaurant in Tel Aviv, and the idea would be that she would cook and Kafka would be the waiter on tables. Of course, he developed that only when he was too sick to actually realize this dream.
Yes.
And he was claimed by tuberculosis in Prague in 1924. Then in 1939, Kafka's friend Max Brod had to flee Nazi-occupied Czechoslovakia. And the only place that would take him, the only place that would open its doors to Max Brod and his wife, was then Palestine. And he arrived with a single suitcase that held most of his heroes' manuscripts. It included the three never completed novels of Franz Kafka, that is The Trial, The Castle, and America, along with many diaries and notebooks and correspondence. And that's how it arrived that's how these works arrived in Tel Aviv. And Max Brod spent the rest of his life until 1968 in Tel Aviv, where together with this very close friend of his, Esther Hoffe, they edited and published these novels and works of Franz Kafka. And I should add one thing, which is that the decision of Max Brod to betray Kafka's last instruction wasn't just a betrayal, wasn't just the decision, let's say, to publish the novels and the unfinished works. It was also a decision to publish very personal and intimate things like the letters to Kafka's lovers, like Kafka's famous letter to his father, like Kafka's diaries. So Max Brod is, on the one hand, a betrayer of Kafka's will. He's also a rescuer of Kafka. He's also the one who is responsible for, he's the first biographer of Kafka. He published the first biography of Kafka in 1937. So he plays all these roles, both during Kafka's lifetime as a sort of literary champion, as somebody who's always urging him to write and to publish, and after his life as the great creator of the Kafka myth. So I say in the book that in some sense, although Max Brod was a very successful and popular novelist, it's one interpretation is that his greatest creation is actually the figure of Kafka.
When Max Brod is running away from Prague, he's coming to Israel. It's very interesting that Max Brod, when he's leaving Prague, he takes all Kafka's manuscripts in a suitcase and he leaves Prague. Whereas his work, Max Brod's work, he gets it shipped to Jerusalem later. It's very touching actually.
It's very touching because he of course had to leave in great haste. He was on the last train that was allowed to leave Czechoslovakia and cross the Polish border, and it's quite amazing, as you say, that in his haste he puts Kafka's manuscripts first at the top of his priority, and months later he arranges for his own papers and his own personal effects to be shipped to Tel Aviv.
In fact, by the time Max Brod is more popular as a writer than Kafka at that time, so to say, right?
Oh, absolutely, yes. He was in some senses the opposite of Kafka's temperament. Max Brod was very outgoing. He published a great deal, sometimes a book every year. He was much more popular in Prague than Kafka, who published quite little in his lifetime. And that's sort of one of the great features of this friendship, was that Max Brod knew that his own work would be overshadowed by Kafka's. He always knew that, and yet he made this decision. So what's almost a tragic element in this is that after 1948 in newborn Israel, Max Brod failed, in a sense, to revive his own literary career, but instead he flourished as a keeper of Kafka's flame. And I should mention also to your listeners that he wasn't just publishing this material. He was also a very interventionist, let's say, heavy-handed editor. So in some sense, the Kafka that we know, even the works, is a creation of Brod. We have to read Kafka broadly, so to speak. So he is, striking out passages in the diaries that he thinks should not be published. And he is giving order to novels that Kafka left unordered. So he's really a very heavy-handed and interventionist editor at the same time.
Now, there are three parties involved in this case. One is the National Library of Israel, and the other one is Esther and Hoffe's family, and the German Literary Archive. These three are the parties. Please tell us about the motivation of each of these in claiming the ownership of Kafka's manuscripts.
Sure. You had two states, Israel and Germany, that sought somehow to instrumentalize and appropriate Kafka's legacy. I think it's very interesting. I quote in one of my pieces, I quote a novella by the American Jewish writer Philip Roth called The Prague Orgy. And in there, he has a Czech writer, he says, "When I studied Kafka, the fate of Kafka's books in the hands of the Kafkaologists seemed to me more grotesque than the fate of Joseph K., the main protagonist of the novel, The Trial." And that's something that's amazing to me that happened in this trial as well, which is that these two countries, to begin with them, wanted to somehow recruit or claim Kafka's legacy. So in answer to your question, the first is the Israeli side, which claimed Kafka as primarily a Jewish writer, as a writer who belonged to the Jewish people, as a cultural asset of the Jewish people. And this claim, of course, was controversial from the very beginning, but it becomes all the more so when we realize that the legal case rested on the presumption that the State of Israel somehow represents the Jewish people, and the position of the National Library of Israel relied on this conception of the state that is an implicit understanding that somehow Jewish cultural assets and legacies outside of Israel eventually and ultimately and properly belong in Israel. So in a sense, it's what came out in a very interesting way in this trial is that the diaspora writers, and there is no more diasporic writer than Franz Kafka, could be subject to being brought to Jerusalem if and only if the diaspora is conceived as a kind of unredeemed, fallen realm, right? Kafka, as I mentioned, was not a Zionist, and yet he was still subject to this legal appropriation. I spoke to one of the great translators of Kafka into Hebrew. His name is Shimon Zanbank. And he told me that he ascribed this lawsuit on the Israeli part to, quote, patriotism that had nothing to do with literature as such. Right. Of course, Israel is hardly the only country anxious to secure the prestige of writers. But okay. So that's the Israeli side. The German side claimed that the German Literature Archive in Marbach, near Stuttgart, is the proper home for these manuscripts. First of all, because Marbach already holds a large collection of Kafka's manuscripts, including the manuscript of his novel The Trial, which they bought for 3.5 million German marks at Sotheby's in 1988. And also, more to the point, because in their view, Kafka belongs to German literature, to the German language. Kafka wrote in German. Of course, on the other hand, Kafka was not German in any way. He lived only briefly at the end of his life in Berlin. But still, Marbach joined this long tradition of praise for Kafka's pure German. Hannah Arendt once wrote that Kafka's work speaks the purest German prose of the century. But then the question became that I was thinking about is that to confront the German side, in which ways, does Kafka's multilingualism, his marginal Czech Jewish origins, what do we have to do to that in order to stand him up as a quintessentially German writer? And then finally, the third side of this triangle of the legal process was the Hoffe family itself, which represented sort of the private interests of this case. So when Max Brod died, he himself bequeathed all these papers, including the priceless Kafka papers, to Esther Hoffe, who lived until the age of 101. And when she died in 2007, she gave them to her daughter in turn, this priceless stash to her daughter Eva Hoffe. And at that point, that Israel stepped in and said, no, you can't, these are not personal property. This is too important. This is like a national cultural heritage. And therefore, the sort of stakes were set. You have European universalism on the one hand, Israeli particularism on the other, and Eva Hoffe herself always told me that, she thought of this as a violation of her family's own privacy. For her, Max Brod was first and foremost a kind of father figure who helped to raise her, and she thought that she should have the right to decide.
Yeah, I read a wonderful piece that you wrote for New York Times. And you said, you're talking about Germany's interest. You said, here lay a potent irony. A writer who raised self-condemnation to an art would be used as an instrument of self-exculpation, of effacing rather than facing up to the past. So wonderfully written. Could you please elaborate on that?
This is, in a sense, sort of how many people in the century since Kafka has died have pulled Kafka's legacy into this or that political cause. And this most recent chapter, of course, in this contentious afterlife, is in a sense about connecting a national we to Kafka's name. So this trial that started in 2007 and that culminated in 2016 really can be read as a commentary on this question. Does this writer, who after all you can say that he was a member of a Jewish minority within a German-speaking minority, within a Czech minority, within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, does this writer with so many identities belong to German literature or to the state that regards itself as the representative of Jews everywhere? So this was the great irony in this case. The writer who himself, wrote about self-condemnation was being used now as an instrument of overcoming the past, right? And this was a writer, not just any writer that was being claimed in this way. That's what I want to say. He was a writer that always pulled himself away from the temptations and the invitations of collective belonging. In other words, one way of saying it is, Kafka really felt nowhere at home, but therefore, in a sense, he was everywhere at home, Now, in our time, we live in this time of when cultural heritage is becoming nationalized, when artists are being appropriated as objects of cultural prestige. But in a funny way, Kafka was the least possessive of people. He was not interested in being claimed or possessed. The famous line where he says, what do I have in common with the Jews? I have hardly anything in common with myself. And then the less well-known quote is something that he told Max Brod. He said, he was talking about about possessiveness, and he said, well, everything that I possess is directed against me. And yet, what is directed against me, I no longer possess. It's no longer my possession. So, of course, the judges in the Israeli Supreme Court had to give a decision of ownership one way or the other, black or white. But they couldn't help but serve as like these last, as I interpreted them, the sort of the last of, or the latest of Kafka's gatekeepers of interpretation, right? And their verdicts, although they were in legal language, could be understood as kind of readings or misreadings of Kafka, or the latest page in a long, long history of reading and misreading Kafka's afterlife. So that's what I mean when I talk about the instrumentalization of how Kafka was used by these different parties.
Israel's argument, they centered around Kafka being Jewish. How Jewish is Kafka in your opinion?
I'll put it this way. Kafka was deeply interested first in the Yiddish language, deeply invested in Yiddish literature and Yiddish theater. He and Max Brod would go countless times to the Yiddish theater troops when they came through Prague. He gave only one public speech in his lifetime, and that was a speech on the Yiddish language, trying to subvert the usual condescension towards the Yiddish language as being somehow lesser than the German language. He also, at the end of his life, was fascinated by the Hebrew language, and among the manuscripts that are now in the National Library in Jerusalem that I've had the chance to leaf through are his Hebrew vocabulary notebooks, where you have columns of words in German and the corresponding words in Hebrew. And he studied Hebrew quite intensively at the end of his life. So he was fascinated by Jewish languages, you might say, and one way of putting it is that he wrote German as if it were a Jewish language. On the other hand, unlike Max Brod, he was not a Zionist, as I mentioned. And part of that is that he had this larger sense of never really arriving, So one writer that I quote in the book calls him the poet of non-arrival, meaning matrimony or marriage is one form of arrival that he never allowed himself. Coming to the promised land, to the state of Israel, is one form of arrival that he never allowed himself. And ever since then, there's been a long tradition that started with Max Brod of sort of fantasizing, what if, counterfactual history, what if Kafka had, let's say, survived tuberculosis at the age of 40, and then come as a young man, 41-year-old, to Tel Aviv, There's a long line of novelists from Max Brod through Nicole Krauss who have imagined this. It's almost an irresistible temptation. I once posed this to Eva Hoffe herself, and she said, "Ach, Kafka wouldn't have lasted a day here."
It's very strong. Yeah. Now, please tell us about the research involved in writing this book.
First research was getting to tell the story of Esther Hoffe, who was portrayed by many in the press, many journalists who never met her, as a kind of eccentric cat lady. She famously kept Kafka's manuscripts in her apartment on Spinoza Street in Tel Aviv that she shared with like a dozen cats. So you could imagine kind of cats climbing over these priceless manuscripts. And she was very reluctant, therefore, to talk. But over time, over many months, I was able to gain her trust and to be able to listen to her side of the story. And I found her to be very intelligent and a deeply sympathetic woman who in a way was burdened with all of this. In a way, she saw herself as a character out of a Kafka novel, which is to say a solitary woman facing these great state powers, these faceless, wanting to be admitted to the gates of the law, seeking justice, but that justice is always deferred. In a sense, she saw herself as a Kafkaesque character, and that also made it very interesting. So the first element of the research was really, getting to know her, having conversations with her, and also interviewing some of the other protagonists, interviewing the lawyers on both sides, interviewing the director of the Marbach Literature Archive, who thought of...
That's a wonderful episode too. Interviewing Marbach's director, where he was very, very ambivalent, non-committal.
You can understand why, because a German public intellectual would be ambivalent about being perceived as wishing to take something from the State of Israel. So that the research was to essentially to interview the protagonists, to interview members of the Hoffe family, to interview the Supreme Court Justice, one of the three who presided over this case, Justice Eliakim Rubinstein in Jerusalem, and to really look at these manuscripts not just as pieces of paper, but as a thread that connected Franz Kafka to Max Brod, that connected Max Brod's first half of his life in Prague to the second half of his life in Tel Aviv, that connected Max Brod to the Hoffe family, that connected the mother Esther Hoffe to the daughter Eva Hoffe. This was the thread that I tried to, that guided my research.
Now, how do you think the release of Kafka's manuscripts led to a better understanding of Kafka as a person and as a writer?
Those manuscripts that are now at the National Library and are even now being digitized and made freely available to the reading public and to scholars and readers everywhere in the world, they shed light, first of all, on the friendship between Max Brod and Kafka. So they include, of course, not just Kafka's manuscripts, most of which have already been published by now, but also Max Brod's his own diaries and journals, which have never been systematically looked at, which have been kept from view until very recently. It also includes Kafka's drawings. We've known until now only a few of them, and now we have over 100, and we can now understand that Kafka took drawing quite seriously, and we can begin to, and I wrote an article about this myself, we can begin to look at how the visual and the verbal work with Kafka's imagination hand in hand. I'll just give a personal anecdote if I may. I believe it was in 2019, I was contacted by the biographer of Kafka's last lover, Dora Diamant. Her name is Kathy Diamant. She wrote a beautiful book, Dora. And she says, two of Dora Diamant's descendants who live near Tel Aviv have heard about this case and would like to see some of the material in the archives. So I contacted the chief German language archivist in Jerusalem, and he very kindly greeted us and took down volumes of Max Brod's diaries in which he describes his relationship with this Dora Diamant, who was Kafka's last lover. And these descendants, the two descendants, were there, and they were extremely moved to see these descriptions that they had never seen before. And then to cap it off, there, among the papers was a photograph that Dora Diamant had inscribed the back of to Max Brod. They had never seen Dora's handwriting. They had never seen this message before. And then we looked together at the date, and it was, I believe, September 19th, 1929, and we were sitting there on September 19th, 2019. Oh. It was just incredible. So this is going to shed light on Kafka's work, on the friendship, on biographical details that were withheld until now. It's no coincidence that the great biographer, the author of the 3-volume biography of Kafka, Rainer Stach, had to wait to do the volume of the early life last, because he was waiting for some of this material to emerge. So I believe that it will shed light on both of these writers.
Now my final question. The way you ended the book, it's wonderful, really. You ended the book with a parable of Kafka. Interestingly, it is about a series of messages getting lost.
Yeah, one theme, as we've mentioned in Kafka's own work, is the theme of non-arrival. And one of the things that doesn't arrive in Kafka's work, again and again, are messages, including the most important messages, including the most critical messages, or messages that do arrive, but they arrive too late to really matter. The classic case is my favorite of Kafka's Parables, a textbook called Before the Law. It was published by itself, but also included as a chapter in the novel, The Trial, in which you have Kafka imagines a man from the countryside who is seeking justice, who is seeking access to the law, comes to the gate of the law, only to be told by the gatekeeper, you cannot be admitted. Furthermore, even if you were admitted by me to this gate, behind this gate is another gate with a more fearsome gatekeeper. The third gate, the gatekeeper is so fearsome that even I cannot bear the sight of him. And you're welcome to stay. So this man from the countryside, he sees sort of the radiance of the law shining through the door, and he spends his whole life waiting for admittance, an entry into the law, only to be told, just as he's dying, with his dying breath, the gatekeeper bends down and shouts into his ear. He says, "This gate was meant only for you, and with your passing, I'm going to shut it." Another one of the messages that never arrives is in a fragment where Kafka writes about a Chinese emperor who, with his dying breath, and note again the theme of the last breath, the instruction that accompanies death, that parallels Kafka's own last instruction. The emperor, with his dying breath, gives a message. We, the readers, are not privy to what this message is, but the messenger cannot get out of this crowded room. And when he gets out of the crowded room, he faces a very crowded courtyard. And beyond that courtyard, the inner courtyard, is another outer courtyard. And he can never arrive so to deliver this crucial message to its recipient in time. And the last example that I'll give of the non-arrival of messages is where Kafka speaks about hope and the Messiah. And he, at one point, Max Brod says to him something like, "Are you really so pessimistic? Do you really have such little hope?" And Kafka says, "No, Max, I have hope, even infinite hope, just not for us." And elsewhere, Kafka says that that the Messiah actually will arrive, but only a day after he is no longer needed. And so this message, this is sort of, I interpret as a very deep theme in Kafka's work. So Kafka's work, on the one hand, resists interpretation as its own message. On the other hand, it demands interpretation. It's a message that demands our own interpretation. That's perhaps what makes it so fascinating. Adorno, one of the great readers of Kafka, once said that Kafka's work is like a series of parables that have lost, the key to which has been lost. And that makes it almost irresistible in terms of, as I say, both inviting and evading interpretation, as a message that in and of itself carries so many meanings that we're each attracted to want to be admitted into the door, so to speak, the gateway into Kafka's own imaginative universe, his own imaginative world. And that, I think, makes him so irresistible.
Yeah, one more interesting thing that you alluded is that when he gave the instruction to Max Brod to destroy these works, probably he knew that he won't do that.
Yeah, and that's Max Brod's own defense. You know, he became very defensive about this, and for understandable reasons. And he said, "Oh yeah, Kafka mentioned it to me when he was still alive, and I told him I could never do that. You know, so in essence, maybe Kafka, you know, as we say in English, could have his cake and eat it too, in the sense that he could say, yes, I gave this last instruction, but maybe deep in his heart he knew that Brod would never carry it out. He gave his last instruction to the very person who was least capable of executing. That's right.
Yes.
That's right. So the lesson for this is, for all of us, is that if you wish to destroy your own works and your own private correspondence, you'd better do it yourself.
Beautiful. I'll keep it in mind. Thank you very much. Thank you, Benjamin.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for this conversation.